Hello, true crimerers. It is time for a true crime in a short amount of time. Yeah, maybe. This is the case of Eastern Airlines Shuttle Flight 1320. Viewer discretion is advised. On March 17th, 1970, Flight 1320, leaving Newark, New Jersey and heading to Boston, Massachusetts, had about 68 passengers and 5 crew members. This included 3 stewardesses, and also included Captain Robert Wilbur, a 35-year-old. He had recently served 5 years in the U.S. Air Force, and he flew missions in the Middle East, in Africa, in Europe. And his co-pilot was 30-year-old James Hartley. He was a 30-year-old man who was married and had 2 children. Flight 1320 would take off from Newark, New Jersey at approximately 6:45 p.m. that day. This flight was only going to be roughly an hour long, not even long enough to serve drinks. At approximately 7:30 p.m., one of the stewardesses, or now flight attendants, would approach a passenger. This was Mr. John J. Divivo. He was a 27-year-old from New Jersey. He lived in a rough neighborhood. He kind of just lived with his whole family still. He worked job to job. He could never really hold a job. He had become infatuated with witchcraft and tarot cards. In fact, his luggage, after all this was said and done, had no clothing. It had no personal items other than books on witchcraft and the occult. He, for some reason, would call himself Professor. Back when he was 16 years old, he shot himself in the head. And he did so unsuccessfully because he survived. So the flight attendant had approached him and asked him for his $21 airfare. Yes, it was only $21, and yes, they collected the airfare from the passengers during the flight itself. He handed her just $16 in cash. She said, well, that's not enough. And then he reaches into his little, he has like a little camera case. He digging through it, looking like he's looking for money. But instead he pulls out a black revolver and points it directly at her. He then says to her, take me to the cockpit now, and he puts a gun behind her back, and they kind of calmly walk up to the cockpit. He uses her to get the captains to open up the cockpit door, which they eventually do. This is significantly different times, by the way. When he barged in with the gun, he then had the stewardess leave, and they closed the door. He then pointed the gun at the 2 pilots and said, turn this plane and fly east and keep flying east until we run out of fuel. He didn't bark any demands in terms of what he wanted. He just said, keep doing it, and just kept pointing the gun at them. At one point, co-pilot Hartley, he apparently moved suddenly, and John Divivo thought he was going to be attacked by the co-pilot, so he took his gun and he fired 2 to 3 shots into Mr. Hartley. Divivo then took his gun and he pointed it towards the pilot, and he shot him once through the arm. Then, by some crazy miracle, Hartley is not dead. He actually manages to kind of push Divivo, and he gets the gun out of his hand. Then Hartley, who's been shot 3 times, shoots Divivo 2 to 3 times. And then he collapses to the ground. Unfortunately, he would end up succumbing to his wounds, and he died moments later. Basically, this is all happening super fast, and the plane is now heading towards the airport. And the pilot, Wilbur, he manages to call the tower and say, there's a man with a gun. We're beginning our descent and all that. And then Divivo, he gets up after he's been shot. He then lunges himself at the pilot in order to, push the, I don't know what the thing is called, the throttle? I don't know, in order to make the plane crash. But he fails because Wilbur manages to grab the gun and he beats the shit out of Divivo over his head a couple of times until he's knocked out. And then Wilbur manages to safely land the plane in Boston. No other passengers or crew were injured. Obviously, they were mentally scarred, but the only fatality was, unfortunately, Mr. Hartley. Wilbur managed to survive, and after he was fully recovered, he went straight back to flying again. John J. Divivo, he also would survive, and he was taken into custody at the nearest hospital, where he was then patched up and saved. And then as to why he did this, he said, I was just pretty messed up at the time. He said he wanted a little bit of fame. Was this a premeditated thing? Did he plan it the whole time? It's not really known, and it never would be known, because on Halloween night, 1970, while still awaiting his trial, he would hang himself in his prison cell, and he died. This was the first ever hijacking of an airplane in the United States that ended in a fatality. Planes have been hijacked before, but usually no one ever even got hurt, and people just got free drinks out of it. So unfortunately, this was not the case this time. This is why I just don't fuck with planes. Absolutely terrified of them.